In the two previous videos, we explored individual psychology through the lens of the law of three forces or principles, and we discovered that, like the world of God and the material world, these principles are clearly evident in our psychological structures. We took time to explore the practical application of these principles in the realm of integrating disowned psychological material. And we discussed the difficulties and useful suffering involved in this undertaking. And most importantly, we found reason to suppose that the purpose of esoteric religious literature was to facilitate our psychological, or as it was distantly called, spiritual growth. While it might be interesting to note that a fundamental tripartite schematic is evident in the three worlds we are exploring, this knowledge will change nothing by itself. In order for it to be useful, we need to apply it to ourselves, practically, on an individual level. We need to do something with it if we aim to improve our self-knowledge and in the process shed a great deal of our useless and unnecessary suffering. And we need to bear considerable trauma and psychological suffering as part of this process, as we come to fully accept that our idealized self-image and the virtue we ascribe to ourselves is, for the most part, imaginary. And this understanding must be quite deep in order to achieve anything at all. A theoretical or in-principle agreement is completely useless. And so a very good litmus test is that unless we become truly horrified with how we actually are, unless we feel deeply ashamed and more likely than not fall into depression and self-loathing, we have not yet seen ourselves as we truly are. And so, from an esoteric religious point of view, we have not put ourselves in a position to even begin working towards psychological integration. As we work towards a more realistic understanding of ourselves, we must be careful not to catastrophize. Most of us cultivated an unrealistically idealized self-image without even realizing it. So we must resist the temptation of replacing it with an unrealistic negative self-image, which is often how these epiphanies go. We must come to see how conflicted we actually are, that our behavioural dispositions are driven by our reaction to external events, a great many of which occurred in early childhood and continue to direct our behaviour. For every positive aspect of ourselves, whether real or imaginary, we find a corresponding negative trait, just like in the world of physics, where every particle has a corresponding antiparticle, and every God or Christ must have a corresponding negative expression, a devil or an antichrist. We are perched between these two aspects, two possibilities, two courses of action every day in everything we do, in the choices we make, although, as things stand, more often than not, we have no choice. We are at the mercy of the external events, past and present, which drive us. And whichever personality, and whichever of the multitude of our inner world is evoked, rises to the surface and inhabits us. We're at the mercy of everything that happens in the external world, since our psychological states change according to changes in the external world, and each state calls to the surface a different I, a depressive I, a happy I, a victim I, or a proud I, an ecstatic I, a childish I, a generous I, a compassionate I, a grandiose, petty, or vindictive I. So really, as things stand, we have no choice. Our psychological states are almost entirely externally driven. So choice becomes possible only when we really understand our situation, through deeply accepting our negative disowned features, through recognising that, like ourselves, others are at the mercy of the inhabitants of their repressed unconscious material, ingrained habits, external influences, and the self-blindness inherent with an idealized self-image. Now we can explore the individual from the point of view of functions or constituent parts. In previous videos, we saw how the individual is composed of psychical and physiological properties. But the early Greek philosophers, particularly Plato, no doubt influenced by older teachings, recognized that the individual, like the city in Plato's Republic, contained three constituent parts: two psychological properties, the intellectual and the emotional, as well as a physical component. We can now map these on the schematics we use to illustrate the three worlds from the point of view of the dyad, or binary opposites, and rearrange the orientation of our triad accordingly. Plato referred to these three properties of self as logistikon, that aspect involved with the rational mind, logic, intellectual thought and reasoned facts; thymoides, that aspect involved in emotions, particularly anger and temper, as well as the wish to be and to do good; and finally, epithematikon, that aspect interested in satisfying base instincts and desires of the body, such as sex and food. In Plato's allegory of the city, the philosopher kings ruled and made decisions about the affairs of the city. They correspond to the mind in this allegory, the army corresponding with emotions, and the common citizens corresponding to the body, were denied this power and instead went about the work most suited for them and for which they were designed. Justice, according to this metaphor, was when the rational mind is put in charge of decision-making rather than the emotions or the body, that the emotions in particular did not side with physical desires, nor did they interfere with the decisions of the rational mind. Very similar allegories are found in Eastern narratives, such as Gurdjieff's story of the horse, cart and coachman. In this allegory, the horse represents our emotions, the cart our body, and the coachman represents a rational mind. The coachman or mind is meant to be in charge of the other components. He controls and properly directs the horses, our emotions, and the carriage, our body, has no authority at all. It merely follows. Only the driver in the story is governed by the unconscious aspects of self. He is asleep at the wheel. He is asleep to himself. In order for things to run as they should, the driver must first wake up so that he can guide this organisation properly. This particular allegory includes many other concepts, but the central ideas are very much the same, and we can find a number of similar allegories such as the house full of servants, which correspond to Plato's ideology regarding the three divisions of the individual and their just and proper place. And actually, in the dialectic of Phaedrus, Plato uses a very similar allegory of the chariot, the driver, and two horses. In this symbolic rendering, the driver represents the mind, and the black and white horses represent the contrasting desires of the body and the emotions, which the driver must control and direct. Very similar artworks appear 1,000 years later, in the major arcana of the Visconti Sforza and Marseille tarot decks of the 15th and 16th centuries, as well as in more contemporary iterations, where they intend to highlight similar ideas. While these three characteristic divisions of ourselves are not especially controversial, and we can easily distinguish them in ourselves, quite remarkably, there are some who cannot distinguish in themselves a difference between thoughts and emotions, while others struggle to distinguish between emotions and the sensations of the body. As we mentioned earlier, the Kabbalah of Jewish mysticism recognized three corresponding fields of study: the practical, emotional, and intellectual aspects of work, along the same three lines as described everywhere in Eastern literature. We find these divisions made in ancient and modern meaning-making pseudo-systems, such as numerology and the Enneagram of type. And these three aspects are included in virtually all systems of type, including Jungian and Myers-Briggs typology, astrology, the tarot, and many others besides. Gurdjieff made another very important observation in his ideology. He recognised that people are characteristically divided into three types. Those whose centre of gravity resides in the body, and whom he referred to as man number one. Those whose centre of gravity resides in his emotional body, whom he called man number two. And those whose centre of gravity resides in their rational minds, whom he described as man number three. These numerical associations are not at all arbitrary, as we will soon see. The human brain contains three basic areas which are deeply and numerously connected with each other. The first of these, which used to be called the reptilian brain, controls the basic movement and essential functions of the body: circulation, breathing, the endocrine system, heartbeat, movement, and so on. The second main area is often referred to as the limbic system, and it is involved with emotions and emotional memory. The third is known as the neocortex, or new bark. It is involved with decision-making, cognitive processing, rational thought, and executive functions. In terms of evolution, the hindbrain was the first to develop, followed much later by the limbic system, and finally in recent times, the neocortex. So the association of these three component parts with the numbers 1, 2 and 3, which we find in Jewish mysticism, Gurdjieffian ideology, Gnosticism, certain forms of numerology, and the triads of the religious world, including the Christian triad, are not coincidental or without significance. Similarly, the hierarchical structure represented by the human brain is especially evident in almost all of these systems and pseudo-systems. In religious literature, the highest faculties are also viewed as the lightest or least dense. So just like in Plato's allegory, the rational mind is the highest, followed by the emotions, and then the physical aspects. Now, having satisfied ourselves that the individual is fundamentally arranged on the same principles as religious triads and those of physics, we come to a very interesting juncture. Those who have researched the symbolism of esoteric religious teachings will notice very early on that both God and the individual are alternatively represented as a triad or a tetrad. And this troubled me greatly at the beginning, and for a long time, because I wanted my understanding at the most basic level to be solid, otherwise everything else that followed would be in doubt. It took me years to make sense of it. Jung, I later discovered, came to the same impasse, and this comforted me. Like myself, as should be clear from all that we have discussed so far, Jung viewed the individual and God as a tripartite entity for many years. In time, he shifted his position. After many years of studying the symbolism of indigenous cultures and religious literature, and began to view both as a quaternity. This shift in perception alienated some of his orthodox Christian friends and, indeed, cost him some friendships. For the rest of his life, he explored and wrote about his quaternal view of the individual from the point of view of psychological arrangements and type. While there is no shortage of evidence to substantiate his point of view, it differs from my own. You see, we've considered God and the individual from the point of view of the monad, dyad, and triad in order to discover how they are alike. So we can legitimately view the individual quite correctly from all three different points of view. Each further division defines essential characteristics that the previous only generalized. The picture of our binary division into psychological and physiological is refined by the distinction between two psychological properties, thought and emotion. So we can expect our physiology to likewise contain two physiologically related but essentially different aspects. What this fourth element of the individual consists of was not immediately evident, and many students simply assume Jung to be correct, in the absence of compelling evidence one way or another, and define the four essential elements of the individual as mental, emotional, physical, and intuitive. In all probability, Jung assumed that because the invisible, omnipresent, spiritual God had three component parts, then likewise the individual must possess three psychological characteristics. But we can prove beyond reasonable doubt that he was quite wrong about this. To begin with, while we can be quite sure about the reality of our emotions, thought, and our physical body, intuition is a very contentious property, falling more into the realm of ESP than factuality. We can, however, arrive at a more accurate picture of the individual as a quaternity by looking at the tetragrammaton process of Jewish mysticism and cross-checking it with the same point of view which we find in the Kabbalah, Gejefian ideology, the design of the human brain, religious literature, and evolution itself. We will begin that journey in the next video. Thanks for listening.